The first cub arrived through the smoke in the jaws of a lioness, not dragged, not shaken, carried. Helen Brooks saw the shape emerge from the red-gray haze just beyond the first aid station, and for one suspended second, every sound in the world seemed to pull away. The generator coughed behind her. The emergency radio spat static. Somewhere beyond the acacia flats, dry grass exploded with the sharp crackle of fire. But Helen heard only the lioness breathing. It was a broken, rasping sound. The lioness came down the service track, with her head low, her shoulder fur singed black along one side, her golden coat smeared with ash. Her eyes were red from smoke, narrowed to slits, not soft, not pleading, not human. Wild eyes, frightened eyes, focused eyes. In her mouth hung a cub, no larger than a heavy house cat, limp but alive, its little chest fluttering under a coat dusted white with ash. "Do not open that door," Miles said behind Helen. He was 27, one of the seasonal fire medics, and his voice cracked high on the last word. He had been trained for snakebite, heat stroke, dehydration, broken ribs, panicked tourists, and smoke inhalation. He had not been trained for a lioness laying a cub on a concrete step. Helen did not move. The lioness stopped 10 feet from the station door. The wind shoved smoke across the clearing, hiding her for a moment, then revealing her again like something pulled out of an old dream. Her jaws opened. The cub dropped softly onto the dust. It made one faint sound. Not a cry, not yet. Only a thin leak of air. Helen's hand went to the latch. "Helen," Miles whispered. "Please." The lioness lifted her head. For a moment, her gaze fixed on the station window. Not with trust, not with gratitude, but with a hard, burning alertness. Her tail twitched once. Her ribs moved fast. She looked over her shoulder toward the smoke wall, then back to the cub. Then she did something none of them expected. She turned away. The lioness did not collapse. She did not come closer. She did not wait for human comfort. She swung her scorched body around and ran back toward the fire. Miles swore under his breath. Helen opened the door before he could stop her. Heat slammed into her face. It smelled of burnt grass, hot metal, animal musk, and the bitter bite of eucalyptus brush catching flame along the drainage ditch. The cub lay on its side, paws curled, whiskers gray with ash. Its mouth opened and closed as if trying to swallow the sky. Helen dropped to her knees. "Get the oxygen," she said. Miles hesitated. "Now." Training returned to his body before courage did. He grabbed the small animal mask from the emergency shelf, the one they used for domestic dogs when fires from nearby settlements sent terrified animals their way. Helen knew it would not fit properly. Nothing about this was proper. The cub's fur was warm under her hands, not burned through, smoke-sick, dehydrated, alive. Behind her, the radio shouted in fragments. North line breached. Wind shifting east. Do not re-enter Sector 4. Repeat, do not re-enter. Helen sealed the smallest oxygen cup she had over the cub's muzzle and watched the fog of breath begin to gather inside the plastic. Miles stood in the doorway, staring out where the lioness had vanished. "She gave it to us," he said. "She just gave it to us." Helen looked up. Through the smoke, just before the fire swallowed the track, she saw something in the dust outside the door. One clear paw print from the lioness. One smeared mark from the cub where it had been placed down. And beside them, almost too small to notice, a second set of tiny prints in ash, not coming toward the station, going away from it. Helen's breath caught. The cub under her hands gave a weak cough. Outside, somewhere beyond the smoke, the lioness roared once. Not loud enough to rule the Savanna, only rough enough to prove she was still alive. Miles shut the door. Helen kept staring at the second prints until the smoke covered them. And then she said the one sentence No one in the station wanted to hear. She didn't bring us her only cub. Helen Brooks had not come to Marula Ridge Reserve to become brave. At 61, bravery felt like a word younger people used before they understood how expensive it could be. She had come because a retired nurse with steady hands was still useful in a place where heat stroke could turn a healthy man confused in 10 minutes, where thorn wounds festered quickly, where frightened volunteers sometimes forgot to drink water, and where the nearest hospital was a 2-hour drive on roads that turned to red soup after rain. She came for usefulness, not redemption. At least, that was what she told herself. The first aid station sat at the edge of a fictional reserve few tourists ever saw. Marula Ridge, a wide belt of grassland, dry gullies, low kopjes, thorn scrub, and old elephant paths that cut through the country like memories. It was beautiful in a hard way. Nothing wasted softness there. Even shade had thorns under it. Helen liked that. Soft places had failed her. The station was made of pale concrete with a tin roof, a water tank, a fenced backyard, and one narrow veranda that faced the supply track. On ordinary days, zebra moved in the distance like broken piano keys. Guineafowl scratched at the dust. Lions were rarely seen near the station. They crossed the lower valley at night, moving through grass with the patience of smoke. But that afternoon was not ordinary. A dry storm had passed north of the reserve before dawn, throwing lightning into grass that had not seen rain in months. By noon, 3 separate fire lines had joined. By 2, the wind turned mean. By 3, animals were running in the same direction, which was when everyone knew the fire had begun choosing its own path. Helen had been packing burn dressings when the first impalas came past the station fence. Not grazing, not bouncing, running flat out, white tails flashing, then warthogs, then a jackal with its tongue hanging low, then a troop of baboons carrying infants under their bellies, silent in a way that made Helen colder than any scream. The fire crews had gone east. The station stayed open because someone had to remain where the evacuation road crossed the reserve track. That someone was Helen, Miles, and a ranger named Corin Vale, who had driven out 15 minutes before the Lioness arrived to clear a fallen branch from the southern gate. Now Corin was trapped somewhere beyond the smoke, with a failing radio and a truck that kept cutting out. Helen knew the sound of people trying not to panic. It always lived in the spaces between words. Miles crouched beside the cub, one hand on the oxygen tubing, the other hovering uselessly. Is it going to live? Helen did not answer quickly. She had learned long ago that hope should not be thrown around like a towel. The cub was breathing better, but not well. Its eyelids fluttered. Ash clung to its small nose. When it coughed, its whole body folded around the sound. For now, Helen said, for now is good, for now is what we have. Miles swallowed and looked toward the door again. You really think there's another one? I saw tracks. There are tracks everywhere. Not like those. He shook his head. Helen, smoke does strange things to eyes. Yes, she said. And grief does strange things to judgment. I know that too. The words came out before she could stop them. Miles looked at her, but Helen kept her eyes on the cub. She had been a nurse for 38 years. She had worked emergency rooms, where men came in still smelling of gasoline, where old women apologized while bleeding into towels, where children stared at ceiling lights, because fear had made them too quiet to cry. She knew how to stand still while the world came apart. Except once. Once the world had come apart in a 2-story house in Cedar Falls, and Helen had not stood still. She had fought 2 firefighters, so hard. One of them had carried bruises from her fingers for a week. Her daughter, Anna, had been 29. Anna had gone back inside for a neighbor's little boy, because Anna had always had more heart than caution. She had gotten the boy to a window. The firefighters had gotten him out. Then the stairs collapsed. Helen had been held at the curb while her daughter was still inside. For years, people told Helen there was nothing she could have done. For years, she believed them with her mouth and rejected it with every other part of herself. Now a lion cub breathed under an oxygen mask on the floor of a Savanna first aid station, and somewhere in the smoke, its mother had gone back. Miles adjusted the blanket around the cub. Why would she come here at all? Helen looked at the window. Outside, the smoke shifted in sheets. For a heartbeat, she saw the lioness far off near the drainage cut, a low moving shape against the orange-gray light. The animal was not running randomly. She was angling toward the dry riverbed that curved behind the eastern grass line. Then the lioness stopped. She turned sideways to the smoke, head lifted, ears pricked. Her mouth opened. Helen could not hear the sound through the sealed glass and the generator, but she saw the effort of it. A call, rough, short, urgent. The cub on the floor stirred, its little paws flexed. Helen stood so quickly, her knee popped. Miles followed her gaze. What is she doing? Calling. For the cub? Helen did not answer. The cub was too weak to go anywhere. The lioness could see the station. She knew where she had left it, but her face was turned away from them, toward the fire. The radio cracked alive. Helen, station, do you copy? Corin's voice came through, buried under static. Helen grabbed the handset. Corin, go. I'm south of the wash. Fire jumped the service track. I can see heavy smoke near you. We're holding. A burst of static. Helen, listen to me. No one goes east. Command pulled the line. Wind's turning. That grass is going to flash. Helen watched the lioness disappear again. Corin, she said slowly, have any prides been denning near the eastern wash? A pause. What? Lion cubs. Any known dens near the eastern wash? Another pause, longer this time. Old aardvark burrows near the Blackthorn Bend. We logged lioness tracks there last week, but no confirmed den. Why? Miles looked at Helen with alarm. The cub coughed again. Helen's fingers tightened around the radio, because one of them just came to the station with a cub. The static seemed to fall silent from shock. Corin's voice returned lower. Say that again. A lioness carried a live cub to the station, set it outside the door, and went back east. Miles whispered, don't say it like that. Helen ignored him. Corin said, Helen, you keep that door shut. I am, and you do not follow that lioness. Helen looked out at the smoke. I didn't say I was going to. You didn't have to. Outside, something small and dark fluttered down from the sky and landed on the veranda rail. A burned acacia leaf. Helen stared at it, as if it were a message written in a language she had spent her whole life trying not to learn. By 4 o'clock, the first aid station had become an island. The northern road was blocked by fallen limbs and moving fire. The east was smoke and red light. The south gate was jammed open with Corin's truck somewhere beyond it, half hidden by bad signal. The west track remained clear, but only barely, and command wanted everyone out before dusk. Helen knew the order made sense. That was what made it cruel. Transport arrives in 12 minutes, Miles said, reading from the emergency tablet. His hands were shaking less now, which meant he was frightened in a more useful way. We take the cub west to the temporary holding unit. Wildlife vet meets us there. We leave. That's the order. Helen did not move from the window. The lioness had appeared 3 more times. Each time, she emerged from the smoke near the same curve of the drainage cut. Each time, she stopped far from the station, never crossing all the way in, never approaching the door again. Each time she called once or twice, listened, then turned back east. She was weakening. Helen could see it in the way her hind quarters dipped when she pivoted, in the stiffness of her scorched shoulder, in the thread of saliva darkened with ash at her jaw. The lioness was not performing a miracle. She was losing a race against heat, smoke, and the limits of muscle, and still she returned. Miles said, "Helen, I heard you. We can't help what we can't reach." She turned then. That's what people say when the choice is already made. He flinched, and she regretted it. Miles was not a coward. He was young. Those were different conditions often mistaken for one another. Before she could apologize, headlights washed through the smoke outside. A small utility vehicle skidded into the clearing, coughing dust. Corin Vale stumbled out with a bandage wrapped around his forearm and a radio clipped crookedly to his vest. He was a broad man in his 50s, gray at the temples, with the steady eyes of someone who had spent decades watching animals make decisions faster than people. He slammed the door and came inside. The moment he saw the cub on the floor, his face changed. Not softened, not exactly. Recognized. "That's one of the Ridge females," he said. "You know her?" Miles asked. "I know her route. Scar above the right eye?" Helen nodded. She had noticed it when the lioness lifted her head. An old, pale mark cutting through the fur above one eye. Corin crouched, keeping distance from the cub as if even its weakness deserved respect. "She's been using the East Wash for months. Keeps away from people. Good mother. Nervous around vehicles." "She brought the cub to us," Miles said. Corin's mouth tightened. "She brought it away from fire. We happened to be the hard shelter at the edge of the clearing." Helen appreciated that distinction. Wild animals did not hand over their lives like offerings in church. They moved toward cover, away from heat, around obstacles, along remembered paths. If a human happened to stand in the path of survival, people often mistook that for destiny. But sometimes, Helen thought, survival itself was enough of a miracle. Corin stood. "Command says we evacuate. There's another cub." He looked at her. Helen pointed to the veranda. "Second prince. Smaller stride, heading east. The lioness keeps calling toward the wash." Corin's eyes flicked toward the door. Miles said, "She thinks there's another one." "I don't think," Helen said. "I suspect. That's different." Corin went to the window. Smoke pressed close, dimming the afternoon into a strange copper dusk. "Could be old tracks," he said. "They were on top of fresh ash. Could be from the cub she carried before she picked it up." The stride was wrong. Too clean. No drag, no adult paw beside it. Corin looked at her for a long moment. "You saw all that in smoke?" "I was on my knees." Miles said, "Command won't send anyone back." "No," Corin said. "They won't." His voice told Helen he had already asked about something else and been refused. The radio crackled. "Station, this is command. Confirm evacuation status." Corin took the handset. "Station copies. One injured lion cub at location. Request wildlife vet intercept west route." A pause confirmed. "Human personnel evacuate immediately." Helen stepped close to Corin. "Ask for a thermal drone. No aircraft in that smoke. Ground thermal unit?" "Helen, ask." Corin stared at her, then pressed the button. "Command, do we have a thermal scope or handheld at Station West?" "Static, negative. Thermal equipment committed north line." Helen closed her eyes. Then Miles said quietly, "The old anti-poaching kit." Both of them turned. Miles looked embarrassed by his own memory. "Storage locker, back room. Corin showed me my first week. There's a cracked thermal monocular they used before the new drones. Battery was bad, but I charged everything during the power check yesterday." For the first time in an hour, Helen felt the story tilt. Corin was already moving. The storage locker coughed dust when he opened it. Inside were snake hooks, canvas stretchers, old flare markers, a dented metal case, and a thermal monocular with tape around the grip. Corin powered it on. The screen flickered, died, then returned in grainy white and black. "Barely works," he said. "Barely is what we have," Helen replied. They stepped to the narrow, west-facing side window, where the smoke was thinnest. Corin scanned the clearing first. The vehicle engine, the water tank, the cub on the floor, glowing faintly behind them as heat against cold concrete. Then he turned the device east. The image became confusion. Fire painted everything white. Rocks held heat, stumps glowed, wind broke the smoke into waves. "Nothing," Miles said. "Wait," Helen whispered. At the far edge of the wash, just beyond the curve where the Lioness kept disappearing, something small blinked in and out. Not flame, not rock, it moved. Corin adjusted the focus. The tiny heat shape vanished behind a black smear, then appeared again, low to the ground. Miles stopped breathing loudly. "What is that?" Corin did not answer at once. His jaw flexed. Helen knew that look. It was the face of someone whose orders had just collided with the truth. The radio shouted again. "Station, confirmed departure." Corin lowered the monocular. "Helen," he said, "that could be a hare, a mongoose, anything." From outside came the Lioness's call. The cub on the floor answered. It was weak, but it was unmistakably a cub's cry. The sound passed through Helen like a hand opening an old locked room. For one moment, she was not in Marula Ridge. She was back in Cedar Falls, standing behind a line of emergency tape, while fire chewed through a roof, while someone said, "Mom, you cannot go in," while Anna's voice was nowhere and everywhere. She had not been allowed to return. Maybe she would have died. Maybe she would have failed. Maybe nothing would have changed. But the body does not always grieve according to facts. Sometimes it grieves according to the door that was shut. Helen looked at Corin. "I am not asking a crew to go," she said. "No, I know the drainage map. The wash curves behind the Blackthorn Bend. The fire is moving above the grass line, but the lower channel may still have air pockets. No, I can carry oxygen, wet blanket, smoke hood." "No," Miles whispered. "Helen, please don't." Corin stepped between her and the equipment shelf. "You are 61 years old, retired, and not fire certified. I am a nurse. You are a volunteer. I am a person standing close enough to help. You are not going into a burn zone because a lioness made you remember your daughter." The room went silent except for the cub's breathing. Helen looked at Corin, and for a second the anger in her was so clean it felt almost young. Then it passed. He was right to say it. Wrong to think it was the whole truth. "My daughter died because she went back for a child," Helen said. "I have spent 12 years calling that brave when I talk about her, and foolish when I think about myself. I don't know which word is true. Maybe both. But I know this, that Lioness has gone back 3 times with smoke in her lungs because something living is still behind her. I am not making her human. I am saying she is a mother. That is enough." Corin's eyes shone, but his voice stayed hard. "If you die out there, what does that save?" Helen looked down at the cub. "Maybe nothing," she said. "Maybe one life." The fire popped loudly outside, close enough to rattle ash off the roof. Then the Lioness appeared again. This time she came closer than before. Not to the door. Not to Helen. She stopped beside the water tank, flanks heaving, ears flattened against the heat. In the open light of the clearing, they all saw what the smoke had hidden. Her belly was wet with milk. One side was smeared where a cub had nursed recently. The cub on the floor was too weak to have done that in the last hour. Helen did not speak. She did not have to. Corin looked at the Lioness. The Lioness looked through the smoke toward the wash. Then she lowered her head and coughed, a deep tearing sound, before turning back once more. Corin closed his eyes. When he opened them, the decision had aged him. 8 minutes, he said. Miles stared. What? Corin grabbed the old thermal monocular and shoved it into Helen's hand. You get 8 minutes to the bend and back. I go with you. We do not chase the lioness. We do not approach her. We follow the wash edge. We retrieve only if the cub is reachable, without entering open flame. If I say turn back, we turn back. Helen nodded once. Miles said, command will lose their minds. Corin pulled a smoke hood from the shelf. Then, don't tell them until minute 9. The world outside the station had become a place without distance. Smoke erased the horizon. The sky hung low and copper-colored. Ash moved across the ground in little sideways streams, and every breath through the smoke hood tasted faintly of rubber and old fear. Helen carried a field pack, a small oxygen canister, a wet canvas blanket sealed in plastic, and the cracked thermal monocular. Corin carried a fire rake and a radio turned low. Miles stayed with the first cub, under protest, with orders to evacuate if the west track began to close. Helen did not look back at him. If she looked back, she might stop. The lioness was ahead of them, not guiding them like a trained animal, not waiting like some storybook guardian. She moved in and out of sight, along the edge of the wash, because that was the route her body knew. Twice, she vanished completely. Once she burst from smoke, so suddenly Corin pulled Helen und, a half-burned termite mound, and raised one arm to make himself larger. The lioness saw them, her ears pinned. A low sound rolled out of her chest. Helen froze. Corin froze. No one pretended this was safe. The lioness stood broadside, 30 yards away, scorched shoulder toward them, tail lashing once. Her body said boundary. Her body said danger. Her body said, come closer and I may kill you, even if I am dying. Then from somewhere beyond her, thin and almost swallowed by fire, came a cub's cry. The lioness turned at once, not toward Helen, toward the sound. She disappeared into the smoke. Corin exhaled. That is not permission. I know, it's just direction. I know that too. They moved. The wash dropped 3 feet below the grassland, a dry vein of cracked clay and stone. In the wet season, it would carry brown water down from the ridge. Now it carried smoke, ash, and terrified insects. Burned grass curled along the banks. Small animals had left frantic trails in the powder. Hare, jackal, guinea fowl, mongoose. Among them, Helen saw the lioness's prints deep and dragging slightly on one side. And then she saw the second cub's tracks, tiny, staggered, interrupted by a slide mark where it had stumbled down into the wash. Helen crouched. Corin grabbed her shoulder. No stopping. She pointed. He saw them. The argument ended there. The first proof had been fragile. The second was written in ash. They followed the tracks to the blackthorn bend where the wash narrowed under a tangle of roots. Smoke pooled there so thickly that the world became a gray tunnel. Helen lifted the thermal monocular. The screen trembled in her hand. White heat everywhere. Fire above the bank, hot stones, a glowing branch, Corin's arm. Then under the root shelf, a tiny pulsing shape. There, Helen said. Corin leaned in. I see it. The cub was wedged beneath the roots, half hidden where the bank had crumbled. It had likely crawled there when heat drove it from the den. Or the den had collapsed. Or the lioness had tried to carry one cub out, and the second had followed until smoke overtook it. The exact story belonged to the Savanna and would never be fully translated. But the life in front of them did not require full translation. It required hands. Helen slid down the bank before Corin could stop her. Helen, I can reach. The clay gave way under her boots. She landed hard on one knee. Pain flashed white up her leg, but she kept moving. Above her, the fire snapped through the grass with a sound like paper tearing in a giant fist. The cub cried again. It was smaller than the first, or maybe only more diminished by smoke. Its head lifted weakly when Helen pulled away a fallen root. Its eyes were crusted with ash. One paw was trapped under a braid of roots and collapsed earth. "Easy," Helen whispered, though the cub could not understand the word. Maybe she said it for herself. Maybe for Anna. Maybe for every frightened living thing she had ever touched in the narrow space between life and loss. She wrapped the wet blanket around her left arm and reached in. The cub tried to bite her. The tiny teeth scraped the canvas. Good, Helen thought. Fight me, fight everything. Corin dropped into the wash beside her. Banks catching above us. Lift the root. It's not stable. Lift it. He jammed the fire rake under the root and levered. Helen pulled mud away with her bare hand. Heat rolled over them. Her smoke hood fogged. The world narrowed to root, paw, breath, and the small, stubborn pulse of a cub that did not know. Humans were not supposed to be part of this moment. The paw came free. The cub twisted weakly, claws catching Helen's sleeve. "I have it," she said. Then the bank above them collapsed. It was not a dramatic wall of flame. It was worse, because it was ordinary earth, and burning grass, and hot ash sliding down together. Corin shoved Helen sideways. Something struck her shoulder. The thermal monocular flew from her hand and cracked against stone. The wet blanket slipped. Smoke punched under the edge of her hood. Helen inhaled before she could stop herself. The cough folded her in half. Corin dragged at her pack. "Move!" She held the cub under the blanket and crawled. For 3 yards, she was a nurse again. For 1 yard, she was a mother. For the next, she was only an aging woman in a ditch full of smoke, unable to find air. Corin climbed first, then turned and pulled. Helen pushed the cub up toward him. "Take it." "No. You first." "Take it." He took the cub. A sound rose behind them. Not fire, not wind. Hyenas. Helen heard the whooping calls before she saw shapes through the smoke. 3, maybe 4, moving along the lower wash, drawn by confusion, by weakness, by the smell of fear and milk and burning. Spotted hyenas were not villains. They were survivors. Intelligent, strong, opportunistic. In a fire, every species took what chances it could. But Helen was on her knees, and Corin had a cub in his arms. The lioness arrived like a piece of the fire, had remembered its shape. She came down the bank between Helen and the hyenas, landing heavily, almost falling on the injured shoulder. Her growl filled the wash. It was not a thank you. It was not loyalty. It was a mother placing her body where danger had gathered. The hyenas stopped. The lioness stood with her head low, jaws open, smoke pouring around her. Her ribs heaved. Her back legs trembled. She was outnumbered, injured, half-blinded. Still, the line she drew was clear. Corin whispered, "Do not move fast." Helen could barely move at all. The hyenas laughed and shifted, testing the distance. One stepped sideways. The lioness lunged 2 feet, not enough to commit, enough to warn. The hyena backed. Corin pulled Helen by the strap of her vest. She stumbled, coughed, nearly went down. The lioness did not look at her. The lioness watched the hyenas. That was what made the moment sacred to Helen. Not that a lion had chosen a human, but that for a few terrible seconds, their dangers overlapped. They climbed out of the wash into smoke so thick the station vanished. Corin's radio screamed with Miles' voice. "Where are you? The west track is burning at the culvert." "You have to move now," Corin answered, but Helen could not hear the words. Her lungs had become fire. She walked because Corin's hand was at her back, and because the cub under the blanket made one thin sound against his chest. She walked because years ago she had not been allowed to take one more step. She walked because sometimes life does not ask whether you are ready to forgive yourself. It simply places something living in your arms and waits. Behind them, the lioness roared again. Then the sound broke into coughing. Helen turned. Through the smoke, she saw the lioness, still in the wash, still facing the hyenas. But her body had lowered. Her strength was running out. Helen took one step back. Corin caught her. No, she'll die. She might. We cannot carry a lioness. The sentence was brutal because it was true. A wild adult lioness could not be scooped into mercy, could not be thanked into safety, could not be owned by human grief. Help had limits, and those limits could feel like betrayal. Corin raised a flare pistol and fired toward the far bank. The flare hissed red through smoke and struck near the hyenas. They scattered, not far, but far enough. The lioness used that opening. She climbed the opposite bank slowly, painfully, and vanished into the gray. Helen swayed. Corin caught her before she hit the ground. The last thing she saw before darkness took the edges of the world was ash falling on his sleeve like dirty snow, and the second cub moving weakly beneath the blanket. Helen woke to the sound of rain that was not rain. Water from a hose struck the roof of the temporary rescue tent in steady bursts. Somewhere nearby, pumps thudded. Radios murmured. Men and women moved with the exhausted quiet of people who had argued with fire and survived only by inches. Her throat felt scraped raw. Her chest hurt. A plastic tube rested under her nose. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then she tried to sit up. A hand pressed her shoulder gently down. "Don't," Miles said. His eyes were red, whether from smoke or crying. Helen could not tell. "The cubs?" she rasped. He smiled with his mouth closed, as if afraid a larger smile might break him. "Both alive." Helen shut her eyes. The relief did not feel like joy at first. It felt like pain leaving a room it had rented for too many years. Miles continued, speaking quickly, now that he had good news to spend. "Vet says smoke inhalation, dehydration, minor burns on one paw, but they're breathing. They're in the wildlife enclosure behind the clinic tent. No public access. No handling except the vet team. Corin is yelling at command, so I think he's fine." Helen tried to laugh and coughed instead. Miles gave her water in small sips. "What about her?" Helen asked. He knew who she meant. His face changed. "She came back after dawn." Helen turned her head. Miles nodded toward the far side of the tent. "Not close, just outside the holding fence. Corin says she circled all night. The vet team wanted to move the cubs farther west, but Corin argued to keep them quiet and downwind. She's injured, but standing." Helen closed her eyes again. Standing was not healed. Standing was not safe. But standing was a kind of victory the Savanna understood. By late morning, the wind had dropped. The fire was not gone, but its rage had broken. Crews had carved lines through the grass. The sky remained brown at the edges. The reserve smelled of wet ash and opened earth. Helen insisted on standing. Everyone told her not to. She did it anyway, which convinced Corin she was well enough to be angry at. "You disobeyed every reasonable instruction," he said when he found her gripping the side of a folding table. "You gave half of them. I regret that." "No, you don't." He looked away. "No," he said. "I don't." The cubs were not in cages where visitors could stare at them. They were in a covered recovery pen, screened with shade cloth, warm pads, and oxygen support, handled only when necessary by a fictional reserve veterinarian named Dr. Lila Ivers. Helen watched from a distance through a narrow observation slit. Because distance mattered, compassion did not require closeness. Sometimes it required the discipline to stay back. The first cub was stronger now, pushing its head against its sibling with clumsy insistence. The second lay curled, alive but exhausted. They smelled faintly of smoke and milk. "Will you reunite them?" Helen asked. Dr. Ivers did not answer like a person in a movie. She answered like a veterinarian. "If the mother is stable enough, if she remains in the area, if the cubs can nurse, if we can do it without drawing people too close or stressing her into abandoning the site." A chain of ifs. Helen respected everyone. Outside the recovery pen, the lioness waited beyond the second fence line. She had chosen a patch of shade under a burned marula tree. Her shoulder looked worse in daylight. The fur there was gone in ragged patches, the skin beneath darkened but not open in any terrible way. Her eyes were half closed against the brightness. Every few minutes, she lifted her head and tasted the air. No one approached her. No one called her gentle. No one named her as if naming could make her less wild. Corin had ordered vehicles moved back. The crew kept low voices. No one took souvenir pictures. Even Miles, who could barely stop staring, stood with his hands folded behind him like a child in church. The first attempt came just after noon, Doctor. Ivers and Corin moved the cubs in a covered transport crate to the inside edge of the outer fence, then withdrew behind a blind. The gate system allowed a small, protected release into a corridor that led toward the lioness without placing humans in the open. The first cub stumbled out. The lioness rose. Everyone stopped breathing. She did not rush forward in a sentimental reunion. She stood, head low, nostrils working. The cub gave a cracked little call. The lioness answered with a sound so low, Helen felt it more than heard it. The second cub emerged slower. For a moment it wobbled and fell. Helen's whole body leaned forward. Corin touched her arm without looking at her. "Let her," he said. The lioness crossed the last few yards and reached the cub. She sniffed it, licked its face once. Then she picked it up by the scruff with extreme care and carried it back to the shade. The first cub followed, stumbling, falling, rising again. It was not pretty, in the way people often want wild things to be pretty. It was better. It was exact. Over the next 2 days, the lioness remained near the reserve edge. She accepted no food from human hands. The team left water where many animals could reach it, not as an offering to her, but as emergency support after a fire that had stripped the land. They monitored from a distance. The cubs nursed. The lioness rested. At night, hyenas called beyond the burned flats, and the lioness answered once, with a sound that made every person in camp remember the fence was not decoration. Helen recovered slowly. Smoke had bruised her lungs. Her knee swelled. Her shoulder purpled where the bank had struck her. Command wrote reports. Corin wrote one version. Miles wrote another. Helen suspected none of them contained the full truth, because the full truth did not fit in official boxes. How do you write that a lioness made a retired nurse look at a fire differently? How do you write that an animal did not ask for help, and yet help became possible because of what she did? How do you write that a woman, who had lived 12 years with a closed door, finally walked through one? Not to change the past, but to stop giving it every room in her life. On the third morning before sunrise, Corin came to Helen's cot. "You'll want to see this." She followed him outside with a blanket around her shoulders. The world was gray. Not the gray of smoke, but the soft gray before dawn, when shape exists before color. The burned savanna stretched out in silence, black stems, pale ash, stones exposed. A few acacia trees still smoking at the base. It looked ruined if you did not know grasslands. But Corin had told her the roots below were alive. Fire could destroy. Fire could also clear. The savanna carried both truths without apology. The lioness stood near the edge of the service track. Both cubs were with her. They were unsteady, but moving. One pressed under her belly. The other stopped to sniff a charred branch and sneezed ash. The lioness looked thin in the dawn light, her shoulder raw-looking, her coat stained with smoke. She turned her head toward the station. Helen stood behind the fence. She did not raise a hand. She did not whisper goodbye. She did not pretend the lioness had come for her. The lioness looked for only a moment, then turned away. She stepped into the burned grass, placing each paw with care, testing the ground. The cubs followed. Their small bodies vanished and reappeared between blackened stems. At the edge of the wash, the lioness paused. For one terrible second, Helen thought she might turn back toward the place where the fire had trapped them. But the lioness chose the ridge. She climbed slowly, painfully, toward a line of unburned thorn scrub where the morning light had begun to gather. One cub lagged. She stopped, waited, not lovingly in a human way, not dramatically, simply because the cub was hers, and waiting was part of the work. Helen felt Corin standing beside her. "She'll have a hard few weeks," he said. "Yes, she may lose them yet. I know." He glanced at her. "You okay hearing that?" Helen watched the lioness disappear into the first gold of morning. "No," she said, "but I'd rather respect the truth than decorate it." Corin nodded. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Helen reached into the pocket of her jacket and took out a small photograph, worn at the edges. Anna at 29. Hair blown across her face, laughing at something outside the frame. Helen had carried that photo for 12 years, like evidence in a trial where she was always the accused. She did not throw it away. She did not make some grand gesture. She kissed her thumb, pressed it once to the picture, and put it back. "I couldn't go back for you," she whispered. "But I understand now why you did." The sun broke over Marula Ridge. In the distance, somewhere beyond the black wash and the unburned thorn, a lioness called softly to her cubs. Helen closed her eyes. For the first time in years, the sound of fire in her memory did not answer back. Some stories from the wild do not give us simple comfort. They give us something harder and more honest. A lioness is not a symbol made for human healing. She is not a pet, not a guardian angel, and not a creature waiting to be understood by us. She is a wild mother shaped by hunger, danger, instinct, memory, and the fierce demands of survival. But sometimes, when humans are close enough to witness without trying to own, the wild can show us something we forgot. Helen did not save those cubs because the lioness became tame. She saved them because she paid attention. She saw tracks others dismissed. She respected distance. She listened to behavior instead of forcing a human story onto it. And when she chose to act, she learned that compassion is strongest when it walks beside humility. In real wilderness, no one should ever approach a lion, handle a cub without trained authority, or mistake a dangerous animal's stress for trust. Respecting wildlife means giving it space, protecting habitat, supporting trained rescue teams, and remembering that love for wild animals should never become a desire to possess them. Still, this fictional story leaves us with a question worth carrying. Are there wounds in us that cannot be healed by forgetting, but only by choosing differently when life gives us one small chance to answer with courage? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Would Helen's choice have healed her or haunted her in a different way? And if you want more emotional wildlife stories about courage, loss, and the fragile boundary between humans and the wild, subscribe and come back for the next one.